work have said about imagination, in particular Andy Clark and Michael Kirchhoff, and then bring up a few problems we think that emerge for these for explaining imagination within the framework. Then Sam's going to talk about how we might sort of go maybe more extended or enculturated, and how we can steer the mind with kind of external representations and get a kind of enculturated view of the imagination. Quick caveat, so we kind of in one version of this in a paper format, and also that I presented online. I'll post this link again after the chat. We focus more on the kind of first bit on the negative kind of claims against predictive processing. Today we're going to focus a lot more, hopefully, on the kind of perhaps more speculative positive account that we're looking for, because I think it's going to be perhaps more important and more interesting for the themes of this conference. So yeah, this is Clark and Kirchhoff's. Perhaps we might have selectively quoted them a little bit, but this is what they say about imagining. So Andy suggests that the predictive mind framework suggests a deep unity between perceiving and imagining. He says, perception, at least as it occurs in creatures like us, is co-emergent with something quite like imagination. And further in Surfing Uncertainty, he says, animals capable of forming rich, world-revealing percepts are, if the predictive processing story is on track, animals that understand their worlds and that are poised to imagine them too. And importantly here, it's the generative nature of the processes involved in predictive processing that seems to suggest this close link between perception and imagination. Similarly, Michael Kirchhoff says, predictive processing may be said to represent a departure from the received view by depicting perceiving and imagining as deeply unified and overlapping. Perception and imagination are the psychological results of the brain endogenously generating its own sensory inputs top down. And so I think the key thing here is that it seems to they seem to be equating imagination with this kind of top-down signaling. And what's interesting, I guess, is that things like perception that we used to think were caused by the world seem to be generated similarly to a kind of folk theoretic idea of imagination, in that it's something inside us causing the content, causing the experiences from the top down, causing it endogenously. So it seems both Clark and Kirchhoff equate imagination with any kind of, or something like imagination, with any endogenously generated experiential content. As a result, we get that imagination becomes a kind of building block of all of the kind of experiential processes within this framework. And in particularly because clearly endogenously generated top-down predictions are fundamental and ubiquitous to kind of all processes that go on within the framework. Now, we see a problem with this way of understanding imagination, which we call the problem of ubiquity. So it seems like if imagination is involved in all mental activity in this way, it becomes far too ubiquitous in this picture. We kind of lose sight of what the distinctive mental capacity or the kind of mental act of imagination is. And if we're interested in explaining what's distinctive of imagination, we're going to have to come up with a slightly different characterization of it. So maintaining that all endogenously generated top-down prediction kind of qualifies as imagining just seems like an unhelpfully revisionary, because we initially had some kind of distinctive sense of what imagining was, and now imagining is everywhere. Now, one thing I just want to add here is it may be that there's something like imagery that is ubiquitous in the kind of sense that Clark and Kirchhoff are pointing to. But I think it's really important to highlight that imagery and imagination are not one and the same. You can have imagery that's not associated with imagined contents, and you can imagine without undergoing any imagery. So important part of the picture that we've kind of left out so far, and perhaps is being a bit disingenuous to Clark and Kirchhoff, is the important role that attention might play in how we understand what imagination is. So really importantly here, obviously, attention plays the role of weighting the precision of the error signals in the predictive processing hierarchies. So clearly, we can dampen down certain error signals when we expect them to have low precision. Now, this means that it might be possible to engage in imagination by really dampening the amount of error signal coming from our lower sensory inputs. So the mind is free to roam without being sort of impacted by this incoming sensory error signals. And that might give us some account of what's going on in this offline imagining. And really importantly as well, this doesn't just need to be done by attention and by precision weighting. You can actually take actions which lower lower the precision, the expected precision of the error signals, for example, by closing your eyes. And that seems to be fit quite nicely with the kind of phenomenology of imagining. It's often easier to engage in visual imagination when one's got one's eyes closed. But I think even on this way of kind of readjusting the explanation of imagination within the predictive processing framework, we encounter another problem, which I'm going to refer to as the problem of the Cartesian puppeteer. So importantly, I think imagining, at least as the way we're seeing it, can be seen to differ from things like dreaming, mind wandering, or hallucinating in terms of its deliberateness, right? Imagining is a kind of something we deliberately do. It's a form perhaps of mental action. And we often do it to achieve certain goals, right? We want to create some fiction or gain some knowledge. But in order for imagination to be able to achieve these kind of goals, it must be constrained in some way. But the problem here is that it seems like we're kind of blurring the account of imagination with the kind of predictive processing account of hallucination. Predictive processing says things like, proponents say things like perception is controlled hallucination. And the difference between perception and hallucination is that we get this control from feedback from error signals from the world. And on the kind of decoupled experience account of imagination, seems that imagination is accomplished by dampening the feedback from error signals from the world. But then the question becomes, well, how can imagination then differ from hallucination when there's no world there to control your imaginative contents? So another way of looking at this is another problem of ubiquity, perhaps less serious than the first, but still, it seems that we can't just explain what's distinctive about imagining and particularly what's different from cases like dreaming, mind wandering, or hallucination, where those cases, right, seem to be explained very nicely within the predictive mind framework, precisely because they have an absence of constraints and they kind of wander about relatively freely. Whereas in imagination, we want to keep it constrained, but we don't have these tight constraints from the world doing that control. And I think that interestingly, there might be other things, similar things to say as what we're saying about imagination about perhaps these other 4 to 6 things. Okay, so now we get to this problem of the Cartesian puppeteer. So I think really importantly, the predictive mind framework, one of the great things about it, as Chris Dojager and Joe Dewhurst have argued, and I think Carl and Hobson have agreed in a paper, that it removes the need to have a kind of Cartesian theatre explanation of where the experience takes place. But it seems in order to explain how imagination is controlled, the predictive mind seemingly requires a kind of Cartesian puppeteer instead that sets the constraints on mental action from the kind of top of the hierarchy. Yet, as Dojager and Dewhurst highlight, if a single predictive mechanism is responsible for both perception and action, then there's no space to fit even a metaphorical homunculus who pulls the levers and chooses action. Right? So there's no room for this Cartesian puppeteer who's steering the mind onto certain contents. So we think they're talking about bodily action there, but we think this goes for mental actions too. So we end up with this kind of picture where we've got this nice hierarchy, but it seems like there's need for an extra little Cartesian homunculus in the middle of the hierarchy, steering the mind towards what we want to imagine. Yet this doesn't seem to fit within the framework where the constraints on content seem to be primarily sensitive to the world itself. But again, we think there are ways you can get around this. And one of the ways of doing so is to conceive of imagination in terms of something like on offline action. So already, and this came up a little bit in Carl's talk earlier, in order to decide between different actions, right, it's not enough for the brain just to predict the consequences of whatever action it eventually ends up engaging in, right? Suppose you have to decide between looking left or looking right. Those two actions are mutually exclusive and they can have very different sensory consequences. So in order for the brain to actually make that decision, it needs to model both of the two scenarios, one of which is going to be a counterfactual prediction, a prediction about something that's never actually going to come to be. So this gives us, and maybe measure the salience and things like that. So this gives us the room to kind of think about how the brain generates fictive predictions. So the control and selection of actions within the predictive processing framework already requires the brain to generate predictions about non-actual scenarios. And Giovanni Pezzullo's convincingly argued that offline processes like imagination arise from kind of chaining together predictions of fictive or counterfactual actions. So we get one predicted action, and then given the predicted sensory consequences of that, we can then predict what action would take place and further develop that kind of fictive or imaginary scenario. So Pezzullo puts it like this: so imagination works by the suppression of overt sensory and motor processes, not merely the suppression of overt sensory processes through attention like we talked about earlier. So this permits running imaginary actions that produce a sequence of fictive actions and of predictions relative to future rather than present situations. Importantly here, fictive actions and predictions are not just mind wandering, but are truly controlled towards goals specified at higher hierarchical levels, right? So we seem to get this exactly what we're looking for, where imagination can be controlled to reach the kind of goals that we want it to, given the kind of model of the world that we have. But this leads us to the third of our problems, which we call the problem of radical departures from reality. So I think what's really nice about Pezzullo's account is it does really well explaining the kinds of imagination that prosper by being subject to everyday learned or embodied constraints, right? So this classical case that people talk about a lot in the philosophy of imagination literature about how we can gain knowledge from imagining, right? We can imagine whether the sofa will fit through the door, or you might imagine whether you can jump over the gap and make it. These are really important kinds of imagination to engage in, and one would expect the hierarchical model one's built up to be useful for engaging in these kind of counterfactual predictions, right? That's exactly the kind of content the model already sort of contains. But particularly when we're interested in kind of more creative practices, artistic practice, maybe the writing of fiction and things, and perhaps also other things like mathematical thought, about thinking about multi-dimensional spaces or whatever extravagant things often mathematicians think about, we often deliberately imagine scenarios that radically diverge from our everyday sensory motor interactions with the world. So we think about things that it's unlikely for our model to have built up any kind of representation of. So we think Pezzullo's approach can account really nicely for more mundane cases of what we call everyday imagining, and perhaps you might just want to call these kind of planning, and that's a more dismissive thing. But it fails to account for the really kind of interesting case of imaginative imagining that is particularly interesting when we're thinking about artistic creative practices. So it seems that we fall back to another return to the problem of the Cartesian puppeteer, right? We don't need a Cartesian puppeteer to explain why we might be imagining sort of more mundane things that might be about to happen to us in the near future, things close to our everyday interactions with the environment. But the question is, what is it that steers the mind away from mundane scenarios? It seems there's nothing within the model that can explain why we suddenly take on these flights of fancy, not merely but through mind wandering, but intentionally. So the sort of way of putting it is, who or what is booking our radical departures from everyday reality? Now, we perhaps maybe it feels cruel to have kind of attacked Andy Clark on this at the start. That was kind of just part of the dialectic of the talk, because I think Andy's really clear that he takes a similar view, right? Because Andy says, it seems very likely that for most creatures, acts of deliberate imagining are simply impossible. And we think it's because he's aware of these kind of issues.
So this is where the idea of steering the mind with signs comes in to maybe come to the rescue and potentially solve the problem of radical departures from reality. So just to fill in that quote from Andy, it seems very likely that for most creatures, acts of deliberate imagination, which I suspect may require the use of self-cueing via language, are simply impossible. Right? So we think that this potentially gives us a nice clue, but we sort of want to broaden the scope beyond language and also to think about this in a particular way. And this is where our talk becomes very sort of speculative. Okay, so Clarke takes deliberate imagination in humans to result from the use of self-cueing via language, as I've just said. Perhaps linguistic cueing or other forms of external representation helps to steer attention when we engage in offline imagination, much as it can do in our online perception. And for example, Lupien and Ward demonstrate that linguistic priming can boost otherwise unseen objects into visual awareness. So words and other representations are predictive of their reference. By creatively combining and manipulating external representations, we may be able to steer the mind towards more radical departures from reality. So language, words, images can allow us to cue up combinations of content that are unlikely to naturally emerge as part of our model of the world. So you might take flying and pig to generate flying pig. Now, this idea that external symbols like language allow us to engage in these more radical departures from reality by combining these elements of content raises a chicken and egg problem. Because what we're doing here is we're saying, well, look, this is a way of accounting for imagination. But imagination is usually seen as a precursor to creative use of external representations. Why would one choose to put the words flying and pig together without having already imagined a flying pig? However, creative use of external representations is arguably needed to explain how we are able to engage in constrained and controlled and yet imaginative imagination, right? That's sort of what we're getting at. So which came first? Imaginative imagination, these radical departures from reality, or creativity through the use of external representations, external media in general? Okay, well, maybe the chicken and egg problem only arises if we think about this in the wrong way. Maybe we're thinking about this in the wrong way. So if we think of imagination as a kind of discrete faculty, then it makes sense to ask, right, what comes first? But if you don't think of imagination like that, if you think of it as a complex enculturated activity, then culture and imagination co-emerge. Okay, so I'm going to try and unpack this idea by looking at the notion of enculturated imagination. So I think there are many different ways of thinking about enculturated imagination. But I think there are these two quite interesting options, both of which are kind of conducive to externalist perspectives, but one is more extreme than the other. So according to the one, there is an internal world that is sort of enhanced, scaffolded by external symbols and cultural materialities and art and so on. The second option, which I think is definitely it's quite extreme, but we think it's worth exploring. This idea that there's no recognizably human inner life that isn't the internalization of the external. And one particular version of this is to be found in dialogism. So the work of Charles Fernyhough, who picks up on work by Vygotsky and Bakhtin, the Soviet psychologist. So the idea behind dialogism is that thought is always expressing something to oneself, right? So there's no such thing as genuine monologue. When you're engaging in a monologue, whether that be in inner speech or in outer speech, you're kind of always expressing something to yourself, right? Now, it's worth noting that this might look like we're just talking about language, but it's intended to go beyond logocentrism, right? You can express things to yourself not just in language, right, but in gesture and image and so on. Okay, so this idea of this sort of quite extreme dialogism raises this idea that you might be literally navigating through imaginative spaces as you engage in external materialities, right? So what we've got here is we've got two drawings by children that have then been sort of tidied up and interpreted by adults into these far more polished images, right? But if you look at those drawings, you might ask yourself, to what extent does the child drawing this have the image in mind prior to putting crayon to paper, right? To what extent might they have the right-hand polished image already in mind, right? What we clearly have instead, or what seems to be very plausible, is that we have an exploratory activity, these kinds of feedback loops. Crayon goes to paper, the mark then gets evaluated, and they are, as it were, expressing themselves directly onto the page, and it progresses through these feedback loops. So there might be this idea of external creativity, the idea that, and I think that happens a lot in, not just in drawing, but in speech as well, right? We don't have the clearly formed words in our heads prior to speaking. We speak into the void, into the external world. Okay, so most assume that imagination is a natural faculty of most human minds. But if imagination depends on engagement with external representations, then it may be better seen as the result of inculturation. Imaginative imagination emerges from the way our brains are shaped by engaging in creative cognitive practices that we learn from our ancestors, for example, through painting, sculpture, dance, storytelling, drawing, song, etc. Okay, so in answer to the kind of chicken or egg question, there's a sense in which we sort of circumvent it and they co-emerge, but also there's a sense in which you can answer that question. You can say, well, look, perhaps creativity comes first and then imagination. So we should take seriously the idea that our capacity for imaginative imagination may depend on developing the capacity for external creative practices. Playing with words, pictures, and other external media enables new ways of combining content and imagination. What, how, and perhaps whether one can imagine will depend on the kinds of creative practices one has engaged in or been exposed to. So this would cast imagination in terms of a kind of skill, like Amy Kind suggested. But rather than one skill, it is a whole set of different skills that depend on a range of external practices. So one thing that is really interesting in this perspective is that you will get this enculturated approach suggests that you're going to have culturally determined imaginative spaces, and maybe not just imaginative spaces, but overall cognitive spaces, thought spaces. So one upshot of what we're saying is that if you look at, for example, medieval art, medieval religious art, you're not going to be able to engage with that in the way that a contemporary viewer would engage with it, because they inhabit a totally different culturally determined imaginative space. One obvious example of that is that they would have inhabited a world where there would have been no doubt in their minds about the Christian metaphysics, right? In the way that there might be for us, even for practicing Christians. So yeah, this idea that imagination is deeply enculturated and that inhabiting different cultures opens up different imaginative spaces and potentially even different thought spaces. This makes me think of the talk yesterday about decorum, right? The idea that there are some places that you just might not go, not just in external media, but in imagination, right? Because they're indecorous. Okay, so to sum up, proponents of the predictive mind are yet to provide a convincing account of deliberate imaginative imagination. And this may be done by appealing to the role of external media in steering the mind. Creative artistic practices are a precursor to or co-emergent with, rather than a product of, some sort of faculty called imagination. Okay, thanks.